Commander Lawrence stood in the center of the Defiance Bridge and watched the screens fill with red dots. Each dot was a ship. Each dot was a weapon that could destroy a city. 1,200 of them had just come through the threshold gate, and they were not coming to talk. The Draconians had sent a message before they came. It was simple and clear. Surrender all human space and accept Draconian rule or be destroyed. Nothing more, nothing less. The Human Council had laughed when they heard the message. They had sent back a message of their own. No, that single word, no. Now the Draconian fleet was here, and Lawrence knew what that meant. The Draconians did not understand the word no. They did not understand resistance. They had conquered 11 civilizations in the last 100 years, and every single one had surrendered without a real fight. The Draconians were the most powerful military force in the known galaxy. They had never faced an enemy that said no and meant it. Lawrence was about to change that. "Report," he said to his first officer, Lieutenant Maya. Maya's fingers moved fast across her console. Her face was pale but steady. She had been trained for this her whole life. Every human soldier knew this day might come. 1,200 Draconian warships confirmed. They are maintaining formation. They are not attacking yet. It looks like they are scanning us. They want to understand what we have. And what do we have? Nothing they care about, Maya said honestly. 200 ships. Most of them are not even combat vessels. We have transport ships mixed in with our fighters. They must see that we are nothing to them. Lawrence nodded. That was exactly what the Draconians would think. They would see the human fleet and think it was a joke. A child with a toy sword facing a trained soldier. They would think the battle would be over in minutes. They would be wrong. Behind Lawrence in a secure location on Titan, Doctor was in her laboratory watching the same feeds. She had been studying the Draconians for 6 months. She knew their ships better than anyone alive. She knew how their weapons worked. She knew how their defensive shields moved. And most important, she knew their biggest weakness. The Draconians thought they knew how to fight. They had been fighting the same way for 200 years, conquering the weak, crushing resistance, taking what they wanted. They had never fought an enemy like humanity. An enemy that did not care about winning or losing, only about surviving with honor. Reached for her communication device. "Commander Lawrence, are you receiving my data feed?" Lawrence's earpiece buzzed. His voice came through clear and calm. "Yes, Doctor, I have your analysis." "Then you know what we have to do. We cannot fight them in space. We cannot match their firepower. But we can make them think we are doing something different. We can make them afraid." Lawrence smiled, was right. The key to everything was making them afraid. Fear made soldiers make mistakes. Fear made commanders make bad decisions. The Draconians had never been afraid in their lives. They had no practice in it, no training for it. That was their weakness. "Tell me about the evacuation status," Lawrence said to Maya. 17 billion people are already off Earth. We have moved them to the asteroid colonies and the Mars settlements. The population centers in the inner system are empty except for military personnel. When the Draconians arrive and find no one to conquer, it will confuse them. "Good, now send the message to all civilian vessels. Tell them to run. Tell them to jump to hyperspace and scatter. Make it look like we are losing." Maya hesitated. "Sir, that will make it look like we are abandoning Earth." "We are abandoning Earth," Lawrence said. "That is exactly what we want the Draconians to think. They will chase the civilian ships while we prepare something special for them." Over the next 3 days, the Draconian fleet moved deeper into human space. They found empty worlds. They found abandoned stations. They found no resistance. The human military had disappeared. The human population had scattered. From the Draconian point of view, the invasion was proceeding perfectly. Humanity was doing exactly what every other conquered species had done. They were running. They were hiding. They were surrendering without even putting up a fight. Supreme Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his sensors. The Draconian commander had led 100 conquests. He had seen 100 civilizations bow before Draconian power. He had destroyed entire worlds without hesitation. He did not feel fear. He did not feel excitement. He felt nothing except the cold satisfaction of absolute power. But deep in his mind, something was wrong. The human evacuation was too organized. The human retreat was too clean. There were no desperate last stands, no heroes trying to protect their homes, nothing that suggested panic or chaos. Instead, it was like watching a dance. Every human ship moved exactly where it was supposed to move. Every message the Draconians intercepted said exactly what the Draconians expected to hear. It was too perfect, called his strategist to him. Analyze the human retreat, find me something that is not right. The strategist spent an hour studying the data. Finally, he came back to, Supreme Commander, the humans are moving their ships in 3 different directions. One group is heading toward Mars, one group is heading toward the asteroid belt, and one small group is heading toward Mercury. Why would they split their forces? Asked. Unknown, but it is inefficient. It will make them easier to destroy separately. Perhaps they do not understand basic military strategy. Did not believe that. Something about this did not feel right. Send 1/3 of our fleet to follow the human refugees. Keep 1/3 in this sector. Concentrate the rest on Mercury. If the humans are putting ships there, they must think it is important. In the deep mines under Mercury's surface, Doctor was making the final adjustments to a machine that should not exist. It was a gravitational lens. It took the sun's natural gravity and bent it like water through a glass. It was impossible. According to every physics textbook, it should not work. But the mathematics said it could, so had built it anyway. How much longer? He asked his assistant, Robert. 2 hours, Robert said. We are ready to activate on command. Looked at the power readings. The device was connected directly to the sun through a quantum fiber. It was going to draw more energy than humanity had ever used for a single weapon. When it turned on, Mercury would shine brighter than it had in billions of years, and any ship caught in the gravitational field would be torn apart. Tell Commander Lawrence we are ready, said. On the Defiant, Lawrence received the message and felt something like peace. Everything was in position now. Everything was ready. The trap was set. The Draconians thought they were hunting humans, but humans were hunting them. All ships go to silent running, Lawrence commanded. No transmissions, no active sensors, become invisible. When the Draconians arrive at Mercury, they will find nothing but a planet waiting, and then they will learn what it means to be hunted. Maya looked at him with something like fear in her eyes. Sir, if they split their forces like the strategist predicted, we will be facing 400 ships at Mercury. I know, Lawrence said. That is exactly what I want. The first wave of Draconian ships appeared on Mercury's sensors at 4:30 hours. Commander Lawrence was ready. His fleet had been hiding in the shadow of the planet for 12 hours. 200 human ships, armed with every weapon that humanity had ever created. They were hopelessly outnumbered. They were about to face an enemy that had never lost a battle. And they were about to win anyway. Because Lawrence understood something that the Draconians did not. War was not about strength. War was about will. War was about refusing to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. War was about thinking in ways that your enemy had never imagined. All units, this is Defiant One, Lawrence said into the communication system. Lock weapons. Prepare for the first attack came from an angle that the Draconian commander did not expect. 300 mining ships came out of hyperspace simultaneously. They were not real warships. They did not have shields that could protect them. They did not have weapons that could hurt the Draconians. They had only one thing that mattered. They had 300 fusion reactors set to overload. The Draconian sensors did not know how to classify this threat. These were not combat vessels. These were not military ships. These were civilian mining vessels flying directly into Draconian formation and then exploding. Evasive action, the Draconian commander ordered, but it was too late. The first explosions bloomed like flowers in the black of space. 14 Draconian warships went dark immediately. 32 more suddenly lost their shields and started to lose pressure in their hulls. The Draconians had never seen this tactic before. They had no defense because they had never fought an enemy willing to use its own people as weapons. For the first time in 200 years, the Draconian military suffered actual casualties in combat. Commander Lawrence watched the explosions light up his screens and felt the weight of what he had just done. 300 volunteers had just given their lives. 300 men and women who had said goodbye to their families and walked into their ships knowing they would not come back. They had done it so that humanity could have a chance. All units execute second wave, Lawrence commanded. His voice did not shake, but his hands were not steady. The human warships came out of their hiding place like a swarm of angry insects. They were small compared to the Draconian vessels. They had less armor. They had less firepower. But they had something that the Draconians did not have. They had nothing to lose. They had already sacrificed. They were already moving on borrowed time. The Draconian fleet tried to organize a counterattack, but they were confused. In 200 years, no enemy had ever attacked them like this. Every civilization they had fought had followed predictable patterns. They had tried to defend they had tried to protect their population. They had tried to follow the rules of warfare that the Draconians understood. Humans were not following any of those rules. Maya sat at her weapons console and watched her targeting system lock onto a Draconian destroyer. The ship was 10 times the size of her own vessel. Its weapons could destroy her in a single volley, but she was not thinking about that. She was thinking about the 300 volunteers who had just died. She was thinking about her family on Mars. She was thinking about a future where humanity still existed. "Firing," she said, and sent a spread of missiles toward the Draconian ship. The missiles hit. They were not strong enough to destroy the Draconian vessel, but they damaged the shields. They created a small hole. That was all that mattered. That was all humans ever needed. A small hole, a small chance. The Draconian fleet began to reorganize. The commanders understood now that this was a real threat. They started to move their ships into a more defensive formation. They started to position their most powerful weapons to defend against the human attack. But it was too late. The humans had already done what they came to do. In the asteroid belt, a second group of human volunteers was preparing their ships. These volunteers had different orders. They were not going to explode. They were going to do something worse. They were going to hit the Draconian ships with hyperspace shockwaves. Doctor had created the tactic in her lab. It was based on a theoretical principle that nobody had ever tested. If you created a hyperspace jump inside another ship's space, the shockwave could damage that ship's systems. It was dangerous. It was unpredictable. It might not work at all, but it might, and that was enough for Lawrence. "All sacrifice units, prepare for final jump," the coordinator commanded. "When I give the signal, jump directly into Draconian formation. Collapse your fields immediately after transition." In their ships, the volunteers prepared. Some of them prayed. Some of them thought about their families. Some of them thought about nothing at all because their minds had already accepted death. They were already gone. They were already part of history. The Draconian fleet, still recovering from the first human attack, did not see the second wave coming. 200 volunteer ships jumped into their midst and then immediately began to collapse their hyperspace fields. The shockwaves spread through the Draconian formation like ripples in water. 200 Draconian fighter ships went offline. Their systems could not handle the sudden spatial distortion. The pilots lost consciousness. The ships began to fall toward the nearest gravity well. It was not a massive blow against the Draconian fleet, but it was enough to show them something important. Humanity was teaching them how to lose. Supreme Commander stood on his flagship and watched his fleet suffer. For 200 years, the Draconians had been the dominant military force in the galaxy. They had conquered civilizations. They had destroyed worlds. They had never encountered any real resistance. But now, as he watched his sensors show casualties mounting, understood that something had changed. The humans were not trying to defeat the Draconian fleet in direct combat. The humans were trying to make the Draconian fleet afraid, and it was working. "Concentrate all forces on the human position near Mercury," ordered. "I want their entire military destroyed. I want their ships broken. I want them to understand that resistance is impossible." The Draconian fleet wheeled around and began moving toward Mercury like a massive storm. 1,200 ships converging on the human position. It looked like an execution. It looked like the end of humanity. Commander Lawrence watched his sensors and saw the storm coming toward him. He had been expecting this. He had wanted this. The Draconians were doing exactly what he had predicted. They were abandoning their cautious approach. They were committing their full force to a single location. They were walking directly into the trap. "All combat units fall back to Mercury," Lawrence ordered. "Prepare the special weapon. The moment they are in position, we activate, not before, not after. The moment they commit to the attack." The human fleet started to retreat. It looked like they were running. It looked like they were afraid. The Draconian fleet accelerated, moving faster, trying to close the gap before the humans could escape. They did not know what was waiting for them on Mercury. In the deep mines beneath the planet's surface, Doctor placed his hand on the activation panel. The gravitational lens was ready. The device was fully powered. In his headset, he could hear Commander Lawrence talking to his fleet. Lawrence was telling them to hold position. Lawrence was telling them not to retreat. Lawrence was telling them that in the next few minutes, everything would change. "All units acknowledge," Lawrence said. In 60 seconds, Mercury's gravity is going to become a weapon. Every Draconian ship in range is going to experience forces that their designers never imagined. Many of them will be destroyed. Many more will be crippled. This is where we show them that we are not prey. The Draconian fleet continued to advance. They were now within weapons range of the human position. They were now within range of the gravitational lens. "Activate," said into his radio, and Mercury stopped being a planet and started being a weapon. The gravitational field that erupted around Mercury was so powerful that it bent space itself. Stars in the background seemed to shift position. The Draconian ships tried to compensate, but there was nothing to compensate for. The laws of physics were being rewritten in real time. Escape velocity became meaningless. The definition of gravity itself had changed. 137 Draconian ships were torn apart by the gravitational forces. 264 more were crippled, their hulls cracking, their systems failing. The remaining Draconian vessels scattered in panic, trying to escape the zone of destruction. But Commander Lawrence did not let them escape. "All human units attack now," he commanded. "This is your moment, push them back, do not let them retreat, show them that we are warriors." The human fleet, which should have been destroyed, instead turned and attacked. They were fewer than before. The volunteers had already given their lives, but the remaining human ships had something that the Draconian fleet did not have anymore. They had hope. They had proof that the Draconians could be hurt. They had proof that resistance was possible. The Draconian fleet did not go directly home. Instead, they limped toward their nearest station, needing time to regroup and understand what had happened. Supreme Commander remained on his bridge, reviewing the battle data again and again. Every time he watched the gravitational weapon destroy his ships, he could not believe what he was seeing. The Draconians had faced many enemies over their long history. They had conquered civilizations with superior technology. They had defeated species that outnumbered them. But they had never faced an enemy like humans. Humans who thought in strange ways. Humans who sacrificed themselves without hesitation. Humans who invented weapons that violated the basic laws of physics that the Draconians had studied their whole lives. "The humans were not trying to win," said to his strategist. "They were trying to teach us something." "Teach us what, Supreme Commander?" the strategist asked. "That we are not invincible," said quietly. "That is a lesson that only one species can teach us, ourselves." The Draconians had lost 11% of their combat fleet. Thousands of soldiers were dead. Hundreds of ships were destroyed. The economic cost was enormous. The political consequences would be severe. The Draconian government would demand answers. They would demand revenge. They would demand that go back and destroy humanity completely. But knew something that his government did not know. He knew that destroying humans was not possible. Not anymore, not after Mercury. Commander Lawrence received the intelligence reports about the Draconian retreat with mixed emotions. Yes, they had won. But he knew that winning had cost humanity more than it had cost the Draconians. The Draconians had lost 11% of their fleet. Humanity had sacrificed almost all of their military ships. Every one of those ships had carried soldiers. Every soldier had a family. Every family was now grieving. "How many did we lose?" Lawrence asked Maya. Maya did not want to answer. 473 ships. That means approximately 47,000 soldiers and volunteers. Lawrence nodded slowly. 47,000 people had died so that 17 billion could live. It was the right choice. It was the only choice, but it was still a terrible choice. "Send a message to all Draconian forces," Lawrence said. "Send it through every channel they use, make it clear. If they continue moving toward human space, we will hit them again. If they return, we will be waiting." The message was delivered, and it was received by every Draconian captain, every Draconian commander, and every member of the Draconian government. They understood the message. They understood that humanity had just become a threat that they could not ignore. In her laboratory on Titan, Dr. watched the final reports come in. She saw the casualty numbers. She saw the destroyed ships. She saw the list of names of those who had volunteered to die. She looked at the list and thought about how each name represented a person. Each person had dreams. Each person had loved someone, and now they were gone. But they were not forgotten. Created a database of all the volunteers who had given their lives. She recorded their names. She recorded their words. She recorded their final messages to their families. She wanted humanity to know what sacrifice looked like. She wanted humanity to remember that freedom was not free. On Mars, in one of the refugee shelters, a woman named Sarah received word that her husband had been a volunteer in the first wave. He had been one of the 300 miners who had exploded their ships above Mercury. She had known that he was going to do this. He had told her 3 weeks ago. He had told her that humanity needed someone to step forward. He had told her that he wanted to be that someone. Sarah cried, but she did not cry because she was sad. She cried because her husband had died a hero. He had died protecting the future. He had died so that their children could grow up in a world where humans were not slaves. The Draconian government met in their central chamber and debated what to do. The military commanders wanted to launch a second invasion. They wanted to gather more ships and more soldiers and crush humanity completely. They could not accept the fact that they had lost to an inferior force. They could not accept that they had suffered casualties that meant something. But the political leaders understood something different. They understood that the Draconians had encountered a species that was different from every other species they had fought. The humans had shown them that victory was not always about having bigger weapons. Victory was about having stronger will. "We will send a message to the humans," the Draconian Prime Minister said. "We will tell them that we are withdrawing our forces. We will tell them that Earth is no longer a target. We will tell them that humanity has earned the right to exist as a free species in the galaxy." "This is weakness," one of the military commanders protested. "No," the Prime Minister said. "This is wisdom. To fight humans again would mean to face an enemy that we now understand to be unpredictable and dangerous. To fight humans again would mean to lose more of our fleet. To fight humans again would mean to prove to ourselves that we are not as great as we believed. I will not do that. Not today. Not ever." The message was sent to Commander Lawrence through official channels. The Draconian government informed humanity that they were withdrawing all forces from human space. The invasion was canceled. The conquest was abandoned. Humanity would be left alone. Lawrence received the message in his command center and read it twice. He could not believe what he was reading. The Draconians, the most powerful military force in the galaxy, were backing down. They were accepting defeat. They were leaving. It took several minutes before he understood what this meant. Humanity had survived, not just survived. Humanity had won. "Send a message back," Lawrence ordered. "Tell them that we accept their decision. Tell them that there are Draconian soldiers stranded in our space. Tell them that we will provide safe passage for those soldiers to return home. Tell them that we do not seek revenge. Tell them that we seek only peace." The message was controversial among the human military. Some commanders felt that the Draconians should be punished. Some felt that giving safe passage to enemy soldiers was a mistake, but Lawrence understood something that others did not understand. The Draconians had respected humanity enough to withdraw. Humanity needed to respect that respect. When the Draconian soldiers heard that they would be allowed to leave, there was confusion at first. They had expected to be executed. They had expected to be tortured. They had expected to be treated the way that conquered soldiers were usually treated. Instead, they were being given a choice. They could leave. They could go home. As the Draconian soldiers boarded their transport vessels, something remarkable happened. Some of them approached the human guards. They looked directly into the eyes of their enemies, and in those eyes they saw something they had never seen before. They saw honor. They saw strength. They saw a species that had every reason to exact revenge and had chosen not to. Supreme Commander watched the reports of the human mercy from his command ship. He understood now what had happened during the battle. The humans had not just fought for victory. The humans had fought to teach the Draconians a lesson about what it meant to be civilized. The humans had fought to show that true strength was not about destroying enemies. True strength was about standing up against impossible odds and refusing to fall. "Send a personal message to Commander Lawrence," ordered. "Tell him that the Draconians recognize his victory. Tell him that humanity has proven itself worthy of respect. Tell him that we will not return." Lawrence received the message, and for the first time since the battle began, he allowed himself to rest. The war was over. Humanity had survived, but the real work was just beginning. On every human world, people gathered to remember the dead, to remember the volunteers. To the days after the battle were strange and difficult for humanity. The victory was real, but it did not feel like a victory. It felt like survival. It felt like waking up after a terrible dream and realizing that the dream had actually happened. The cost was too high. The sacrifice had been too great, and yet without it, humanity would not exist anymore. Commander Lawrence stood in a memorial hall on Earth, looking at the names of the dead. Every name was a person. Every person had a story. Every story was now part of human history. The volunteers who had piloted the mining ships were honored above all others. They had given up their lives knowing that they would never see the victory. They had never known that their sacrifice would lead to Draconian withdrawal. An old woman approached Lawrence. She was small, with gray hair and kind eyes. She introduced herself as the mother of one of the volunteers. Her son had been a pilot on the first mining ship. "I wanted to say thank you," said. "My son gave his life for humanity. I know that. I accept that. But I also know that his death meant something. He made a choice. He walked toward danger because he believed it was the right thing to do. That belief is what makes him a hero. That belief is what makes humanity worthy of being saved." Lawrence listened to words, and he understood something about humans that the Draconians would never understand. Humans found meaning in sacrifice. Humans believed that death could have purpose. Humans could choose to die for something bigger than themselves. In the years that followed, humanity began to rebuild. New ships were constructed. New soldiers were trained. New weapons were developed. But more important than any of these material things was a change in human consciousness. Humanity understood now that they were not weak. Humanity understood that they could face an enemy and survive. Doctor was appointed as the new ambassador to alien species. Her job was to help humanity interact with other civilizations in the galaxy. Many of those civilizations had heard about the battle at Mercury. Many of them wanted to know how humanity had done it. How had they defeated the Draconians? How had they survived? Traveled to different alien worlds and told the story of the battle. She explained the tactics. She explained the sacrifice. She explained the human willingness to face death with honor. And everywhere she went, the story had the same effect. Other species that had feared the Draconians now understood that the Draconians were not invincible. Other species that had accepted defeat now understood that resistance was possible. The collective, who had been conquered by the Draconians 200 years ago, sent a formal request to meet with. They wanted to understand what humanity had done. They wanted to know if there was hope for their civilization, met with them and told them the truth. "The Draconians are not invincible," said, "but defeating them requires something that most species do not have. It requires a willingness to sacrifice. It requires a willingness to send your own people to their deaths for the chance that others might live. The Draconians expect you to surrender. They expect you to run. They expect you to accept defeat. If you do something different, if you choose to fight even when defeat seems certain, then you can hurt them. You can make them afraid. And fear is the only thing that stops the Draconians." The collective listened to words, and they made a decision. They began to rebuild their military. They began to plan resistance. They began to prepare themselves for the day when the Draconians might return. But the Draconians never came back. Had made his report to the Draconian government, and the response had been clear. No more invasions of human space. No more attempts to conquer Earth. The humans had proven themselves too dangerous, too unpredictable, too willing to sacrifice. It was not worth the cost. But more than that had changed. The battle at Mercury had taught him something about himself. He had learned that victory was not always about winning. Sometimes victory was about respecting an enemy. Sometimes victory was about understanding that you had been wrong. Sent a personal message to Commander Lawrence. In the message, he explained his decision. He explained why the Draconians would never return. He explained that the Draconians had learned a lesson from the humans. The lesson was that there were forms of strength that went beyond military power. There were forms of strength that came from within. Lawrence read the message and understood that something had changed in the galaxy. The Draconians were no longer a threat, not because they could not win a military conflict, but because they had learned to respect humans. And respect, Lawrence understood, was more powerful than any weapon. Years passed. The scars of the battle slowly healed. New memorials were built. Schools were constructed where children learned about the volunteers. Stories were written about the soldiers who had fought to defend human freedom. And in every story, the lesson was the same. Humanity had survived because humans were willing to face death. Humans had survived because humans believed that some things were worth dying for. Commander Lawrence retired from active duty and became an advisor to the government. He worked on establishing new colonies and strengthening human defenses. But he never forgot the battle at Mercury. He never forgot the volunteers. He never forgot the cost of survival. On the 10th anniversary of the battle, a massive memorial was dedicated on Mercury. The memorial stood at the entrance to the laboratory where the gravitational lens had been built. It was a simple structure made of rock from Mercury's surface. The names of every volunteer were carved into the memorial. Every name, every person, every sacrifice. Lawrence stood before the memorial and read the names. He read them slowly, carefully, making sure that he said each name out loud. He wanted to remember. He wanted to honor. He wanted to make sure that these names were never forgotten. As he was reading, a young soldier approached him. The soldier was young, maybe 20 years old. The soldier said that he was the grandson of one of the volunteers. "My grandfather was on the first mining ship," the soldier said. "I never got to meet him. He died before I was born, but I know what he did. I know that he saved humanity. I know that without his sacrifice, I would not exist. And that knowledge makes me want to be strong. That knowledge makes me want to protect humanity the way that my grandfather did." Lawrence looked at the young soldier and saw the future of humanity in his eyes. He saw a species that remembered its heroes, a species that understood the cost of freedom, a species that was willing to stand up and fight for what it believed in. "Your grandfather would be proud," Lawrence said to the young soldier. "He would be proud of you." The young soldier saluted, and Lawrence saluted back. And in that moment, everything 15 years after the battle at Mercury, humanity had changed completely. The solar system was stronger. The colonies were more developed. New technologies had been created based on lessons learned from fighting the Draconians. New weapons had been designed. New strategies had been developed. But more than anything else, humanity had changed in ways that could not be measured in ships or soldiers or weapons. Humanity had learned confidence. Humanity had learned strength. Humanity had learned that survival was possible even when the odds seemed impossible. Doctor had spent the last 15 years traveling between different star systems. She had become one of the most respected scientists in the known galaxy. She had taught other civilizations about the techniques that humans used to survive the Draconian invasion. She had helped establish defense treaties between different species that feared the Draconians. She had become, in many ways, a symbol of human wisdom. But on a quiet evening on a research station orbiting, received a message that changed everything. The message came from the Draconian government. Supreme Commander was requesting a formal meeting with human leadership. Sent the message to Commander Lawrence, who was now retired and living on a research station near Saturn. Lawrence read the message and thought carefully about what it could mean. The Draconians rarely requested meetings. They never requested meetings as equals. The fact that they were requesting this meeting suggested that something significant was happening. Lawrence traveled to the diplomatic station that had been established in neutral space, halfway between human territory and Draconian territory. He brought with him. He knew that understood the Draconians better than anyone. Supreme Commander arrived 3 days later. He looked older now. The years had worn on him, just as they had worn on Lawrence. The Draconian commander stood before the human representatives and began to speak. "I have come to ask for something that no Draconian has ever asked for," said. "I have come to ask for a formal alliance between our species. The galaxy is changing. New threats are emerging, threats that are even more powerful than the Draconians, threats that require the strength of multiple civilizations working together." Lawrence listened carefully. "What kind of threats?" Thus said, and there was fear in his voice. There were a civilization that had remained hidden in the far reaches of space for thousands of years. They had recently begun to emerge, and their technology was beyond anything that the Draconians or humans had ever seen. "Why should we ally with you?" Lawrence asked. "Why should we help the species that tried to destroy us?" "Because," said, "I have learned something in these 15 years. I have learned that humans are not your enemies. I have learned that humans are warriors worthy of respect. I have learned that together, humans and Draconians are stronger than we could ever be separately. And most importantly, I have learned that if we do not stand together, they will destroy us both." Looked at Lawrence, and Lawrence looked at. They did not speak, but they understood each other. This was a moment that would change human history. This was a moment where humanity could choose to accept an alliance with a former enemy. This was a moment where the sacrifice of the volunteers could lead to something greater than simple survival. "We will consider your proposal," Lawrence said finally. "But understand this. Any alliance between humans and Draconians will only work if there is real trust. Real trust means that you must accept humans as equals, not as a conquered species, not as a subordinate species, but as equals. "I understand," said, "and I accept those terms." Over the next year, negotiations took place. Scientists from both species worked together. Military commanders from both species created joint defense plans. Political leaders from both species drafted formal agreements. And through all of this, something remarkable happened. Humans and Draconians began to understand each other. The Draconian soldiers who worked with human soldiers learned that humans were not weak or cowardly. They learned that humans had different ways of approaching problems, but those ways were often effective. They learned that humans could be trusted. They learned that humans kept their promises. The human soldiers who worked with Draconian soldiers learned that Draconians were not evil or cruel. They learned that Draconians valued honor and discipline just like humans did. They learned that beneath the hard exterior of Draconian warriors, there was something very similar to the humanity that existed in human hearts. Commander Lawrence spent his final years working on the Human-Draconian alliance. He traveled between human territory and Draconian territory. He met with leaders from both species. He helped establish the first joint human-Draconian military base. He worked to make sure that the alliance was built on a foundation of respect and mutual understanding. On his deathbed, surrounded by his family and by Dr. Lawrence spoke his final words. "Tell them to remember," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Tell them to remember the volunteers. Tell them to remember that humans are stronger when we believe in something. Tell them to remember that peace is built on strength, not weakness. And tell them that the Draconians are not our enemies. They never were. Our only enemy was the belief that we were not capable of surviving." When Lawrence died, it was not just a human death. Attended the funeral. The Draconian commander stood beside Lawrence's grave, and he spoke words in the Draconian language that were translated for the human mourners. Spoke about honor. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about the respect that had grown between their two species. "Commander Lawrence taught us more than warfare," said. "He taught us about strength. He taught us that true strength comes not from power, but from the willingness to stand for what you believe. He was a great warrior, but more than that, he was a great teacher, and humanity will honor his memory forever." Years passed. The Human-Draconian alliance grew stronger. Together, they faced the threat and survived it. Together, they established peace in regions of space that had known only conflict. Together, they showed the galaxy that even the most bitter enemies could learn to trust each other. On the 50th anniversary of the battle at Mercury, a massive celebration was held. The celebration took place on a neutral planet, with representatives from dozens of different species attending. There were humans and Draconians standing together. There were and representatives from dozens of other civilizations. They gathered to remember the volunteers. They gathered to honor the sacrifice. They gathered to celebrate a victory that had changed the galaxy. Doctor, now in her 80s, was honored at the celebration. She was given the title of Friend of All Species. She was recognized for her work in building bridges between different civilizations. She was celebrated for her understanding of the Draconians and her ability to teach other species how to face overwhelming odds. As accepted the honor, she spoke to the assembled representatives. "The Draconian fleet crossed into human space," she said, "and they never returned home, but that was not the end of the story. That was the beginning. We learned from that battle. We learned that sacrifice has meaning. We learned that honor is more powerful than any weapon. We learned that even enemies can become allies if we are willing to trust each other." Looked out at the crowd, and she saw humans and Draconians standing together. She saw species that had been enemies now cooperating as friends. She saw a galaxy that was learning to build peace instead of waging endless war. "Volunteers who gave their lives on Mercury made this possible," continued. "Their sacrifice did not just save humanity. Their sacrifice saved the entire galaxy because they showed us that another way was possible. They showed us that we could survive. They showed us that we could stand up against overwhelming odds and not only survive but eventually triumph. That triumph is not measured in military victories. That triumph is measured in the fact that we are here today, all of us, standing together." The celebration lasted for days. Humans and Draconians shared food and stories. They showed their children the monuments that had been built to honor the dead. They told the stories of the volunteers. They taught the next generation about sacrifice and honor and the power of standing together. And on a quiet night after the celebration had ended, stood before the memorial that had been built to honor the volunteers. He read the names carved into the stone. Every name, every person, every sacrifice. He thought about the day when the Draconians had invaded human space. He thought about the fear that his forces had felt when they first realized that humans were willing to fight. He thought about the respect that had grown in his heart as he learned more about human courage. "Thank you," said quietly, speaking to the spirits of the volunteers. "Thank you for teaching us what it means to be strong. Thank you for teaching us what it means to be worthy of respect. Thank you for making it possible for humans and Draconians to stand together. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Your sacrifice changed everything." The Draconian fleet had crossed into human space, and they had never returned home. But in the end, that invasion had led to something more beautiful than any military victory. It had led to understanding. It had led to alliance. It had led to peace. And the volunteers who had given their lives in the depths of space, in the shadow of Mercury, in the darkness between worlds, had made it all possible. Their names were remembered. Their sacrifice was honored. And their legacy would live on forever in the hearts and minds of humans and Draconians who had learned, through suffering and sacrifice, that there was a better way to exist in the galaxy than through endless conquest and endless war. The story of the Draconian invasion was not a story about defeating an enemy. It was a story about becoming strong enough to forgive an enemy. It was a story about learning that peace is harder than war, but infinitely more rewarding. It was a story about humanity. It was a story about sacrifice. It was a story about the power of hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. T had been sacrificed. Everything that had been lost, everything that had been given up became something more than just death. It became legacy. It became hope. It became the foundation of humanity's future. The Draconian fleet had crossed into human space, and they had never returned home. But that was not the end of the story. That was only the beginning of a new chapter in human history, a chapter where humans understood their own strength, a chapter where humans knew they could face any enemy and survive, a chapter where humans stood tall among the civilizations of the galaxy and knew they belonged there. The soldiers, to remember everyone who had given their lives so that humanity could remain free. The names were carved into monuments. The stories were told to children. The lessons were learned and taught and learned again. And in the deep mines of Mercury, the gravitational lens was shut down. It would never be used again. It had served its purpose. It had shown the galaxy that humans could not be conquered. That was enough. The threshold gate remained open, but the threat was gone. The darkness that had threatened to consume humanity had retreated. The galaxy had learned that humans were not weak. Humans were not easy prey. Humans were warriors. Humans were survivors. And most importantly, humans were capable of mercy. And that proof was worth more than all the advanced weapons in the galaxy. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, the human fleet had lost 73 more ships, but the Draconian fleet had lost more than half its total strength. They had lost the belief that they were invincible. They had lost the conviction that humans were easy prey. They had learned in the most brutal way possible that every species was capable of producing warriors. Every species, given a reason to fight, would fight. And as the Draconians began their retreat toward the threshold gate, they understood something that no Draconian had ever understood before. They understood fear. They understood what it meant to face an enemy that would not surrender. They understood what it meant to encounter a species that chose honor and sacrifice over simple survival. The humans had won, but not through strength. They had won through will. They had won through determination. They had won through being human. When I give the signal, we are going to show the Draconians what it means to fight a species that will not surrender. In her laboratory on Titan, Dr. watched the sensors light up with incoming Draconian ships. She knew what was about to happen. She knew that in the next few hours, human soldiers were going to die. But she also knew that they were going to prove something that no species had ever proven before. They were going to prove that humanity could not be conquered. "May you find strength," she whispered to the empty lab. And in the space above Mercury, Commander Lawrence gave the order. "Execute Hydra Protocol. All units attack."